Welcome everybody, good evening and welcome to Nature's Happy Hour. This week's Cocktails, Controversy and Conservation. I'm Chris Gam of the Nature Conservation of New South Wales. Nothing says a fun night out like a discussion about peak demand, gigawatt hours and grid infrastructure. The front line of climate change though is action in the energy market. There is no better place for us to dramatically reduce carbon emissions than weaning ourselves off dirty fossil fuels like coal and gas and onto clean energy like solar and wind power. But anyone who's been to a family barbecue will tell you there's always a crazy uncle ready to point out that the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. And sometimes that crazy uncle is the Prime Minister of Australia. So tonight's panel is a rare breed. They all have Twitter accounts, but they all also know what they're talking about. Jackie Mumford, I have a joke for you. Are you ready? What's a wind turbine's favourite colour?
I don't know, but I am a huge fan of renewables.
It's blue. Wind turbine's favourite colour is blue.
Oh my gosh. You might have to put that joke into battery storage, Chris. But let's get on with the solar panel.
Okay, now before we meet our guests, hit us with some of those ground rules again.
Can do. So for any newcomers to cocktails, welcome. The first rule of cocktails is grab yourself a drink, a cocktail or a glass of wine.
Okay, I've got mine. Now, I just mentioned it before, but I think we need to address this scandal head on, which is this, are my questions actually being read comment that's been floating around. What do you have to say to that, Jackie?
Yes, we are reading your questions. Please write them in the chat. There's a Q&A box or there's a chat box where you can write your questions. We will try and read them out. We can see them, but there are a lot of questions and not a lot of time.
Yeah, we've only got half an hour and we have typically had about 800 people watching. So we're trying to bring you something that's both interesting and mercifully brief. We are recording the show, so you can watch it later on Facebook, or as somebody pointed out to me, not everybody's on Facebook, so it's also on YouTube.
Yeah, and you can follow the chat on Twitter using the hashtag Nature's Happy Hour. And you can follow Chris at Chris Gambian because he needs some more friends on Twitter. And you can follow Nature New South Wales at Nature New South Wales on Twitter.
And of course, if you are enjoying yourself, please, if you can, pop over to nature.org.au and send us some money because
koalas grow on trees, but money does not. And
this week we learned about the perilous state koalas are in, but we're going to try to turn that around. Now, over to our speakers tonight. Simon Holmes is a leading energy commentator and analyst. He's the director of the Smart Energy Council and senior advisor for the Energy Transition Hub. Simon writes regularly for The Guardian and many other media outlets on Australia's clean energy transition. David Osmond, Dr. David Osmond, I should say, is a senior wind engineer at Windlab. He's a passionate environmentalist. He was involved in Windlab's modelling of a 100% renewable energy grid. And Dylan McConnell is a PhD researcher at the Australian-German Climate and Energy College at the University of Melbourne. He's worked for the Melbourne Energy Institute from 2011 to 2016. Dylan has a detailed understanding of the Australian national energy market and the cost structure of energy technologies. Jackie, we've got some questions for our guests.
Yeah, we sure do. So as keeping in theme with the topic for tonight, I thought we'd just start. If each of you could share your thoughts on, is the technology for the clean energy revolution ready to go? Or do the sceptics have a point?
Shall I start? I mean, it's definitely ready. I should say it's already underway. You know, we've had a good decade now where renewables have rapidly ramped up from just a couple of percent of energy. I should say wind and solar has ramped up from a couple of percent up to about 18% these days. Obviously, there's been lots of bumps along the way, so ideally we want to iron those out, but things are, but yeah, definitely we're in the midst of a clean energy revolution.
Great. Simon?
Yeah, so fortunately, a lot of people have been looking at this now for a long time. I wrote a piece recently that looked at all the scenarios I could find on transition, on how the grid might develop, and I found 15 different studies. 2 of them were authored by the other speakers tonight, Dr. David Osmond and Dr. Dylan McConnell. So they'll probably go into them a bit more later. But every one of those I think, ultimately 15 or 16 scenarios. Every single one of them took us to very high proportion of renewables in the grid, kept the lights on, achieved the least cost of the pathways forward. And interestingly, every one of them ends up with less gas than we have right now. So rather than gas being a transition fuel, every single one of these studies shows that as we move to high renewables scenarios, we end up needing less gas, not more, which is quite away from the political orthodoxy. But certainly everyone who's looked at it has found that. I'd love to talk a bit more about one of those studies in particular. Shall we do that now, or shall we go to throw this question to Dylan?
No.
Let's know.
Okay, so I'll let David and Dylan talk about their studies, but one that I've spent a lot of time with, and I know the other panelists have as well, is AEMO, the energy market operator that's responsible for keeping the lights on and managing the market. AEMO has put together a study called the Integrated System Plan. This actually came out of the Finkel Review. The Finkel Review, interesting, in its own scenarios, they predicted less gas and showed that no matter which way we go, we're going to end up with a lot more renewables in the grid. But they wanted a lot more rigor around their studies. And one of their recommendations, which AEMO took up quite willingly, was to put a lot more rigor into the modelling of how our grid might develop. And it's been a huge effort. I heard recently, I spoke to the manager at AEMO responsible for that process, said that over 100 person years have gone into that report, and it's $10 million a year budget, and they've been working on this latest version for 2 years. So it's the most in-depth study done on any grid anywhere in the world, and the most in-depth study on Australia by orders of magnitude. That they modelled about 7,000 scenarios going forward. Each of their modelling is looking at certain constraints on costs or emissions or policy, but each of them are looking for the least cost pathway forward. And of the 6 or 7 major scenarios that they're publishing, there are 2 of interest. One is called Central, which is business as usual. So what they think could well happen if there's no additional policy. And even under that policy, we hit 50% renewables in 2030 and 75% by 2040. Under their step change scenario, which Dylan takes some credit for framing of what that scenario what it looks like. But under that scenario, Australia achieves 93% renewable by 2040 or 2042, I think. And that their least cost pathways forward. What's fascinating in those is the difference in cost between business as usual and the high renewable scenario is relatively small. So business as usual, the total costs of running the grid, so that's all the new power lines built, all the generators and all the fuel required to provide all the power between now and 2042. Under the central scenario, it's 85 billion. And under the step change, the high renewable scenario, it's only 5 billion more, 90 billion. That covers everything in the electricity network. So only a very small increment gets us there. And what's fascinating in those scenarios, the lights stay on. They make sure it's not a question of what happens. Just to be glib, when the wind don't blow and the sun don't shine, we're going to be just fine. Those scenarios they've modelled make sure the lights stay on, and those. That plays very much into Australia's decarbonisation. People talk about how difficult it is to achieve decarbonisation. I think it's much easier than most people think. It's just really two things we've got to do. We've got to electrify everything, and then we've got to switch to renewables, and we can do them both at the same time. And we know from all these studies that we can do so keeping the lights on and using a lot less gas as our coal fleet phases out. I'll pass over for now.
Yeah, thanks Simon. Just Dylan, just on that question of kind of the potential pathways and the sort of road we're on, do you want to just chime in on that? Is this road inevitable?
Yeah, to some degree. I mean, look, when we're talking about the electricity sector, the sort of end point is not something that's as much under debate as it used to be. It's rather just the speed at which, or the time at which it takes to get there. Essentially because as it will be news to no one, renewable energy is the lowest cost form of sort of new generation and lowest cost of cheap electrons. That's, invariably going to dominate our electricity sector in the future. It's a matter of when that occurs and whether or not that occurs fast enough to, avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So when it comes to the electricity sector, it's certainly much more a case of a question of speed rather than destination. That's less true when you start going outside of the electricity sector, and I might just talk about some more out there scenarios that some of the people in my research group and myself look at, the so-called sort of 200% renewable scenarios or 500% renewable scenarios. When we're talking about those sort of deep decarbonisation pathways, so looking at things like electrifying everything, but also things like electrolysis to produce hydrogen and potentially make steel with green hydrogen and or export hydrogen, etc. Those sort of futures are a little bit more speculative, let's say. But what is not speculative is what the bulk of the where those electrons going into that future will come from, and that'll be predominantly wind and solar, and perhaps in Australia more so solar, but that's still very much a debatable point. But yeah, the high penetration renewable energy system is we're going to get there eventually, but we have to make sure we get there fast enough for climate reasons. So I guess that's something that's also worth reminding people of, is that even though the electricity sector gets a lot of attention, it is actually only about a third of our emissions. Transport is almost, it's close to a third, and it's growing quite fast. So we've got agriculture sector, we've got industrial emissions, and we do actually have to start doing stuff to those. Generally, that involves electrification, and that's where the idea of 200% scenarios and 500% scenarios come from. They're talking about basically doubling our electricity sector or more in order to decarbonise those other harder to sort of decarbonise sectors. But I guess a key thing from the results of that work is it's certainly possible with existing technologies, and it's basically it's a similar process, similar model to the models that Simon was talking about, the AEMO's integrated system plan. Make sure the lights stay on, achieve supply of electricity at lowest cost, and it is invariably dominated by wind and solar and a sort of mix of balancing technologies. Yeah, well. But I might leave it for David to talk about a sort of a different and quite interesting approach or way of thinking about this problem as well.
Yeah, David, tell us a little bit about this 96% renewable work that you've been doing.
Yeah, so I've been lucky enough at work. They let me play with data on the side, because I've always been interested in how we'd go with most of our generation coming from wind and solar. And, the last few years, AEMO's provided lots of good data about wind and solar farms located all across the national grid. And, well, I should say the last few years, it's become more geographic diverse, so we can start to get an idea of what it would have liked if we had wind and solar all across the national grid. And so I took 3 years of data and sort of looked how close can we easily get to 100% renewable without having ridiculous amounts of storage, without having to massively upgrade interconnectors, all these sorts of things like that. And what I found is that it's quite feasible to get to 96% renewable without sort of doing anything too drastic. Basically just installing a lot more wind and solar, particularly wind in Queensland, because it's the state that currently doesn't have much wind. And Queensland wind tends to behave quite a lot differently to wind in the other states. So often it tends to be blowing quite strongly in Queensland when it's not blowing so well in the other states. So yeah, my model found that with a modest amount of storage, feasible upgrades to the interconnector, we can get to 96% renewable. And that's where it starts to get difficult. So I stopped at 100. I didn't go all the way to 100%. I mean, it's quite possible to go to 100%, and there are a lot of other studies that have. But the thing is, the last sort of 5% or so, or 4% in mine, it's not really clear at this point what is going to be the solution to decarbonise that last 4%. So, I mean, it's clearly true that there are some cold winter days where we don't have much wind, and you know, hydro is really good at filling those gaps, but it can't do the whole job. And so I found there's sort of still another 4% that we can't do. And so I guess the question is, going forward, what will we do? And one of the hopeful things is hydrogen, as the others have mentioned. With some days where we have far more wind and solar than we actually need, so we can use that use that wind and solar electricity to create hydrogen through electrolysis. And that hydrogen later can be used to create power on the days where we don't have much wind and solar. But another area that we're really just starting to scratch the surface is demand management. So there's a lot of, you know, some people are now signing up to let other people control their pool filter. So pool filters for your backyard swimming pool use quite a lot of electricity. And so if someone else is able to reschedule when it gets run, then that can really help the grid. Other forms of demand management, Simon may talk about this later, but large aluminium smelters, maybe we can make them a little bit more flexible so that at times where there is a shortage, they can use less power, and when there's excess wind and solar, they can use more power. Our hot water systems, you know, currently a lot of them are set to run at midnight, and that's terrible when we start getting all this solar on the grid. We want to start running a lot of them at midday or around noon to use all the excess solar we're generating. So there's lots of things like that. But other possibilities are building long-term storage like Snowy 2.0 or Tasmania's Battery of the Nation. They can go a long way into filling those last few percent. And the other option is, well, we could convert our gas turbines to burn some form of biofuels.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, David. And recently we've seen the New South Wales government's renewable energy zones been flooded with proposals for new renewable generation. What are the barriers to us powering New South Wales with 100% clean energy?
Well, if I start...
Yes, if you want to kick us off, David, but
sure.
we'll hear from Simon and Dylan as well, yeah.
Okay, well, I'll just start off, as I say, transmission is the key barrier. So, you know, we've got no problem building the wind and solar farms. We've got plenty of space. We've got plenty of good sites. But we are running into issues with transmission. And transmission is historically quite slow to build. It may also cause inter-community issues. So it's something we really have to get on top of early to get that transmission out there to connect those renewable energy zones to the grid. But we also really need to stay on top of community consultation, because having a lot of these wind and solar farms pop up in areas where they haven't previously had those sorts of facilities, and also having all these power lines going to these new renewable energy zone, there is potential for community opposition to be built up to become a key risk. So we really need to stay on top of those. Perhaps the others can comment more.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I'll just chime in and say what we've seen from all these other modelling exercises, and especially from AEMOs, is that we're not looking for we don't need any new technology to meet these goals. We know how to get to these high renewable scenarios, to David's 96% scenario, Dylan's team's 200 to 500% scenario. All of these are using currently existing technologies. So just to reinforce what David says, it's the physical build out issues, the community consultation, all the I guess sort of soft and sort of and very real social and political issues but not technical issues. We're not waiting for some amazing new invention or someone for some big breakthrough. We're not waiting for some technology roadmap. We're ready to get on with this. In fact, as Dylan said, we already know, we're already well on this path. We were a decade ago, Australia was about 9% renewable. As Dylan said, Dylan's mentioned, I think we're just on 25%, just a hair under 25% at the moment. We know where we're going. It's just a matter of speed from here.
Yeah, great. One of the questions that's just come through on the chat line is just during COVID and shutdown, have we seen a sort of noticeable drop in energy consumption across Australia?
I can answer that one because I was looking at that today. The answer is no. We basically haven't. Certainly compared to other countries where there has been quite substantial drops in electricity, and I haven't checked this recently, but the United States was reporting a sort of 8% drop in consumption about a couple of months, 2 months ago. Some of the European countries, Italy and Spain, had very, close to 20% reductions in demand, and basically we're basically at the exact same level of demand as we were this time last year. So basically we have not seen a significant drop in demand. We perhaps have grown less than we would have otherwise being the case, but that's, I guess, a counterfactual that we'll never know the answer to. But generally speaking, it's basically within the noise in terms of what happened last year.
Wow. Okay, so there's a lot.
What has had a massive impact, though, that is COVID related, is related to the gas sector. Because gas disproportionately has a disproportionate effect on electricity prices, and because the collapse of gas prices, the collapse of the oil prices, our electricity prices are actually incredibly cheap at the moment. They've sort of fallen 50% compared to the same time last year. That's not good news or bad news. It's depends on who you are. If you're a renewable energy developer, that's probably not good news. But if you're a consumer, maybe that is good news. But that's a sort of reality that's facing the system at the moment.
Yeah, right. So thanks for that. There's a lot of experts on energy policy in Australia, and it seems to me that most of them seem to be blokes on Twitter who've been trained at the University of Hard Knocks. So let me put a few common propositions to you, and just give me your sort of top line reaction to these. Number one, if you're not going to burn coal anymore, you need to move to nuclear. Simon?
Yeah, so I'll address that. I've spent a lot of time researching nuclear, and appeared before the recent federal inquiry back last year. So what we know from all these modelling exercises is we don't need to replace coal with something that has similar characteristics as coal. What the coal power stations are very steady power with very high capital costs to build, long times to recoup their investment, long time to build, and not very flexible. It turns out from all the modelling that's been done that we know that it's much cheaper to put together an electricity system with flexible energy, or rather a mixture of flexible energy, being dispatchable energy, and renewable energy. So renewable energy gives you the cheap power, and then you want the cheapest source of dispatchable coming in after. And David's talked about that. It'll be a combination of hydro, pumped hydro, battery, demand response, some gas. Now, gas might be fossil gas to start with. We might transition to synthetic gas or hydrogen, but we now know that the cheapest is not to go down the plants with the same characteristics as coal. What we also know especially from that inquiry, is that the generation of nuclear power plants is too expensive to build. And while there might be some light at the end of the tunnel for cheaper designs, it's very unlikely that any of them would be available for Australia before 2040. By 2040, it's game over. We will have mostly transitioned to grid, and then it's, I think, very unlikely that there'll be room in the grid for any nuclear at that point. So it's not necessary and certainly not likely.
Dylan, did you want to chime in on that one?
Yeah, sure. Just, I guess, I mean, there's a whole lot of non-technical issues that are also associated. Like, I mean, we have a sort of community opposition to building transmission lines. We have community opposition to building wind farms, solar farms. I think the political and institutional barriers to building it in the time frame that we sort of need to, build, decarbonize the grid is they're sort of incompatible. It's taken almost 6 years, five or 6 years to change a minor rule in the electricity market about how often people get paid, basically, or how often the price is set. Now, how long do you think it's going to take to set up? How long do you think it'll take to set up the correct sort of framework around a nuclear industry, a viable nuclear industry in Australia? We're talking at least 10 years, and that's before you even start, actually building it. And by which case, I think, it's not going to be it's not going to have a large space in the system. At least that's how I see it.
Yeah. And David, did you want to chime in on that one?
I was just going to say, there are a lot of credible studies that show that some countries may need nuclear if, choosing amongst the currently available technology. And so people say, well, therefore Australia will as well. But clearly Australia is quite different to a lot of countries. Firstly, because we're quite a large, geographically diverse country. So the wind, as I mentioned before, in Queensland is often quite different to the wind in the southern states. Likewise, a lot of our solar in Queensland doesn't have a highly seasonal pattern compared to countries that are a lot further away from the equator. The other thing, some of those studies are looking at 100% wind plus solar. And now 100% wind plus solar is quite difficult, but Australia has sort of 7 or 8% hydroelectric from water. And that really helps to fill in the gaps when it's not windy and sunny. It'd be nice if we had a little bit more, but the fact we have some is highly beneficial. So that's another reason why I think Australia won't need nuclear.
Yeah, great. Okay, we're running out of time, so we might just run through some of these a bit quickly. Clean energy means blackouts, says the Twitter trolls from time to time. Thoughts on that? Dylan?
Yeah, sure. That's that often comes up. The answer is no, but it's also, I guess, the wrong question. It's sort of, always try to think of analogies of this. It's sort of like saying, cars cause car accidents. Yes, if you drive your car at 400 k's an hour, you're going to have an accident, but it's sort of, it's the wrong question, I guess, is what I'm saying. What causes blackouts and how they're caused is, probably worth thinking about, because 98% of what we experience as blackout is actually because a tree's fallen on the power line, or a possum's fried somewhere. Now, the 2%, that remaining small amount that is what people are actually talking about when they're worried about renewable energy causing blackouts. This is when it's when supply doesn't meet demand. And this actually happens to any technology. This is not a renewable energy, specific problem. It's impossible to have a 100% reliable system, or it's incredibly expensive. Basically, you can't have a system that is 100% reliable. Coal needs to be backed up, nuclear needs to be backed up, gas needs to be backed up. That's the nature of an electricity system. Renewable energy also needs to have, backup or, reserves in place for for when it's not, it's not producing electricity because, it's not windy or it's not sunny. But, it's not the reliability of the power system is not actually a feature that or function directly of the source that you're getting the power from. It's a system, and how that system is managed and operated and maintained is how you have reliability. Now, how the cost of having a reliable system, it will be different with different sources of power. That's not to say it'll be more or less; it'll just be different. So it's I guess a good example. This you might, for people outside of Victoria, we had a sort of fairly bad set of blackouts, rolling blackouts here in Victoria about 12 months ago, or 18 months ago now, that were resulting from a brown coal-fired power station tripping offline on a hot summer afternoon in it was a 40-degree day. 500 megawatts of power disappeared. That's actually a very hard problem for the power system operator to manage, and yet we can do that. With renewable energy, the problems are different. I guess we have to be able to have resources in place for when the wind isn't shining and wind isn't blowing, the sun isn't shining. But they are forecastable resources, and we can manage this. So yeah, it's sort of the wrong question, but it's also it's not an unmanageable problem. It's essentially a question of what are we prepared to pay for, and how reliable we want our system to be.
Yeah, great. Okay, third one. Gas is a necessary transition fuel. Simon?
So as I mentioned, there are about 16 studies that all show that we as we move towards high renewables, we actually are likely to use less and less gas. And in fact, as Australia's moved from 10% to 25 over the last decade, 10% to 25% of our electricity from renewables, we're not burning any more gas. And it's looking like we're going to burn less and less over the decade. So, there was a time, I think it makes sense to some intuitively that you need gas, but when we actually model it down, we need less and less gas. And that gas is increasingly competing with other forms of dispatchable energy, whether it's pumped hydro or batteries or demand response. I visited a smelter in Germany, aluminium smelter, that has invested to make the smelter line flexible so they can ramp up and down the amount of power going into that smelter. It acts to the grid like a giant battery. It can pull back or pull forward to interact with energy in the system when there's surplus or deficit of energy. It can respond in the same way, playing the same role that gas used to play in that grid. So it's displacing gas. We're moving. Gas now has a lot of competitors, so it's no longer should be thought of as a transition fuel.
Yeah, right.
I'd just add to that. A lot of the narrative around the transition fuel sort of come from about 10 years ago, in Australia in particular, but that is largely because, well, if you think back 10 years ago, it was contested then that it was necessary, but if you think back 10 years ago, renewable energy was a hell of a lot more expensive than it was now. And we had cheap gas. We actually have cheap gas right now, but in the last 5 or so years plus, we haven't had cheap gas. And the idea, the sort of thinking at the time was that we would transition slowly from brown and black coal through to gas, then renewable energy. That may have made sense in the context in which that was thought about 10 years ago, when renewable energy was, renewable energy, solar in particular, has dropped to 80% in capital cost in, I think, the last 6 years. So it's a sort of, that idea doesn't make a lot of sense, that we need to go to renewables via gas that used to be talked about in Australia.
Yeah, right. So last one is for you, David. Renewables put up power bills.
Well, if you look every year, there's a report that comes out. It's called the Residential Electricity Price Trends Report. And it breaks down everyone's electricity bill by components. And it does list 2 components that support renewables that add about $60 per year to our bills. So at first glance, and every year, the media comes out and says renewables are adding $60 a year or $5 a month to our bills. But that only tells part of the story. When you add more renewables to the grid, it puts downward pressure on the wholesale price. And the wholesale price represented about $500 on our typical bill. And so most analysis suggests that the reduction in the wholesale price more than offsets the $60 a year that the green subsidies add.
Yeah, right. Great. Thank you. Jackie, we've probably got time we're just a little over time, but just one question from the chat line.
Yeah, sure. So we're keen to hear, what do you guys think? How is Matt Keane doing as Energy Minister in New South Wales?
We're asking a couple of Victorians and a Canberran, but
Yeah, but I watch closely, and I've seen Matt at several forums and met with him and his office about their plans. I think it's a real breath of fresh air. All the state energy ministers really have stepped up. I don't know if people are aware that while we might be arguing, we are arguing at a federal level about a zero net emissions target federally. Every state and territory has a net zero target, and Matt Keane has been quite forceful behind his. He's to his great credit, he's really pushing this renewable energy zones, and he like me had a very formative trip to Europe last year and visited a lot of decarbonisation projects, and came back and saw firsthand that the rest of the world's getting on with it. Matt absolutely understands that, and he seems to. He took a lot of slings and arrows at him when he came out with a landmark speech middle of last December. He took a lot of slings and arrows from conservative media and some politicians, but to his credit, it hasn't deterred him. He seems to have doubled down. So, big credit to him. That it doesn't. Being on the conservative side of politics doesn't mean that you have to be backward. In fact, he's one of our most forward energy ministers.
Yeah, and I think we'll try to get Matt Keane onto a cocktails, I think, at some point, Jackie, because certainly at NCC we do a lot of work with the government and through Matt and his office, particularly the renewable energy zone recently I thought was a good step forward for New South Wales. Now, fellas, at the end of these things, we always like to play a little game. Are you up for it? Yeah. Okay. This week our game is called Tailor or Troll. Jackie has read 3 quotes, and you need to tell us whether or not you think it is a comment made by Federal Energy Minister Angus Taylor, or was it a troll on Twitter? Jackie.
All right. First one. The new climate religion, recruiting disciples every day, has little basis on fact and everything to do with blind faith.
Was it Taylor or a troll?
I'm going to say that was Taylor's maiden speech.
Yeah. Oh, not maiden speech, but yes.
I was going to say someone's done their homework.
Quote number 2.
Large-scale wind. It's very clear that it's not economic on any grounds.
Taylor or troll?
Taylor again.
Yep. Yeah. Yep, you got it. Yep, Taylor. Quote number 3, Jackie.
Renewables are in my blood.
Oh, that's also Taylor. His grandfather was senior engineer on the Snowy scheme, and he thinks that gives him a free pass to say all sorts of rubbish on renewables. Maybe if we could simplify this, maybe we should say that Taylor is troll.
It's both.
Jackie?
He's trolling the country on energy.
Yeah. All right, last one. Wind turbine syndrome is affecting tremendous numbers of people in their wake. Stop ugly turbines.
Troll.
Yeah, probably go troll on that one.
Simon?
Troll.
Yeah, it's a well-known Twitter troll named Donald Trump. Thanks so much, guys, and thanks so much for joining us and making the time tonight. And thanks to everybody for joining us. Jackie, we're taking a couple of weeks off from cocktails, not from work, just from the cocktails events.
Well, yeah, maybe not from cocktails either, but I do get your point.
We're going to be back in 4 weeks' time, so we're just taking one show off after the school holidays with our next series, so keep an eye out for that.
Yeah, and just tell your friends about us. Nature.org.au if you want to head along and sign up as a supporter, keep up to date with these events and all the other great work that we're doing at NCC.
That support you give us is really fantastic, and particularly thanks to everybody who has donated to us recently through our tax time appeal. It's what keeps the lights, pardon the, is that a pun? Not quite a pun. Keeps the lights on at NCC, and I do really appreciate it. We all appreciate it. Thanks so much to our guests tonight, Simon Holmes a Court, Dylan McConnell and David Osmond. And thanks to all of our guests in this series, Rebecca Huntley, Jane McAllister, Rob McBride, Meredith Bergman, Joe Halen and Alex Greenwich. Thanks also to the NCC team behind the scenes that makes all of this possible. Ange, Jackie, James, and of course you, Jackie Mumford. Thanks.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Good night.
See ya.